a statement made by, I believe, our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, about the threat from ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan. So, Will, tell us about this group and maybe their relationship with the Taliban and why they're maybe a particular threat right now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this is kind of a weird comment I think we got the other day from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. He was doing an NBC interview last week, and he was asked if he thinks that Afghanistan will become a quote unquote hostage situation for U.S. citizens who are stranded there. And instead of answering that question, Sullivan suddenly starts talking about how the Pentagon is very concerned about a potential terrorist attack specifically from ISIS-K, like an attack in Afghanistan, he means. And just to sort of throw that out there all of a sudden, I thought was a little bit strange. Like U.S. officials have often played up this ISIS-K group as something that it's not. I think as some kind of like international terrorist organization. And now they do seem to be trotting them out again, just as things start to kind of be looking bad for them in Afghanistan, just optics-wise, during this very chaotic evacuation. And ISIS-K, it is supposed to be the Islamic State faction in what they call the Khorasan province, which is like this antiquated term for this region that covered parts of Iran and Afghanistan way back in the Middle Ages or something. But that's what this name they've given to basically the Afghan faction of their group. And it has been kind of hyped up as if it is a genuine Islamic State cell that is like planning terror attacks on the West and that has like aspirations for statehood beyond their local region. But that really is not what this group is. Really, this is a bunch of former fighters from the Taliban, the Pakistani branch of the Taliban. And a bunch of them were displaced from Pakistan by the government there. They launched attacks on them. They wanted to chase out the militants. They ended up in Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. And around 2015, a bunch of these former Taliban fighters rebranded themselves as a wing of the Islamic State. They were kind of cashing in on the name at the time. Because if you'll remember, around 2014, 2015, ISIS was still sort of the major militant group everyone was talking about. They had fairly recently at that point just taken all that territory in Iraq and Syria. They were still probably grabbing land at that point. And so, they kind of, cashed in on that name, I think. However, very much like the Afghan Taliban, the Taliban guys aren't really known for launching foreign terrorist attacks, especially not in the West. They are very much concerned with like local Afghanistan, Pakistan issues. And it is kind of funny. This group, the U.S. has actually helped the Taliban fight against them. They are enemies. And Jake Sullivan himself did note that. He said that the Taliban are sworn enemies of ISIS-K. But the U.S. has actually flown air support for the Taliban when it gets into battles with these guys. And this happened enough that U.S. soldiers were jokingly calling themselves the Taliban's Air Force. So this was something that it wasn't just a one-off thing. This happened on quite a few occasions. But anyway, now they are suddenly bringing up this group again. I don't think we had really heard much about ISIS-K from like top-level cabinet officials in quite a while. And I will say, like, the idea that they might launch an attack in Afghanistan, that's not totally implausible. Like, that is at least within their sphere, of influence or whatever.
And they have carried out terrorist attacks in Kabul in the past year. I believe they're the group that actually targeted the Hazara school. And I think it was a bunch of girls that got killed there. And Will, just the only other thing I'll notice in all note in all that was, I believe, as well as the Pakistani government, it was the U.S. drone war under Obama that helped to drive this group into Afghanistan from Pakistan. So just a little bit more U.S. blowback at the root of all this. But go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right. Like they have launched attacks in Kabul before, so the idea that they would do that, it's not. I'm not saying that that's impossible or implausible. I just thought that the way that Sullivan kind of brought this up, it seemed like it was maybe meant as a distraction. Like when the question he was asked was sort of about the evacuations and how chaotic and badly planned that's gone, and so he just sort of deflected to this ISIS-K threat. And so I do wonder if maybe they will start trying to point, to the supposed threat from this group more and more. That is something I'll be watching for. But that is about all I had here.
Can I just add, though, I think it's interesting that it doesn't seem like the administration is at all interested in capitalizing on the fact that you kind of have, even though ISIS-K, as you point out, isn't necessarily an international terrorist group, it is a group that has sworn allegiance to, I guess, the bad daddy. I don't know who would exactly be their allegiance now. And they could kind of play and say, like, look, obviously the Taliban are willing to play ball on these other Muslim groups. You know what I mean? It's not like they're simply just any militant Islamist like in the 1990s is going to necessarily find a safe home in Afghanistan. And they could maybe make that argument out of here, but I'm not seeing that from Jake Sullivan. So that's kind of interesting, because you think that would be good spin for the administration right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. That like that is kind of interesting that he did mention that they are the sworn enemy of the Taliban, but yeah, he could have stressed more that like that I think from their position right now optically like that would make more sense to say, look, the Taliban is not the worst group in Afghanistan. Like there's these other really bad guys, and the Taliban hates them.
Yeah. So, Will, there are some pockets of resistance. I guess that's the way the media is framing it. The mainstream media is framing it that there's groups forming in Afghanistan to resist the rule of the Taliban. And I've seen some pictures from Massoud, from Dostum, and from Noor, who are all Afghan warlords who seem to be assembling some meaningful resistance. Will, like, they have pictures with lines of Humvees. They're saying 10,000 soldiers. I don't know if the pictures show that many, but a significant number of forces. We're not talking about like 10 dudes in a pickup truck or anything like that. This is a significant force. And so, what do we know about this resistance so far?
Yeah. So I have seen some of these pictures you're talking about too. I saw recently there's a big convoy of trucks, technicals like with guns bolted to them, but flying the old Northern Alliance flag. And the Northern Alliance was this sort of multi-ethnic like group of warlords that came together to resist the Taliban when they were, when they took over. And I think there was a lot of, there was all kinds of civil war after the Soviet occupation. And I think the Taliban sort of emerged from that victorious, but they became the government back in the 90s. But the Northern Alliance was one of the like, sort of the major warlord faction that resisted them. And now you do have these groups coming back together. Their previous, their stronghold previously was the Panjshir province. And I think that was one of the only places the Taliban did not have like full control when they actually were the government. And so now you do have these forces sort of gathering there, apparently. There's a bunch of ethnic Tajiks who used to serve in the ANA, the Afghan National Army, who are now, I guess, bringing themselves and maybe some gear into Panjshir. I know that the former now vice president of Afghanistan, Saleh, he went there as well with, I think, the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was this big Tajik warlord. And his son is sort of like taking the mantle for him. And so, yeah, there is sort of like this presence of warlords and fighters gathering now in Panjshir. I'm not totally sure what sort of strength they have. It was actually interesting. Massoud's son actually published an op-ed in the Washington Post the other day. And he was calling on the Friends of Afghanistan, so-called, to sort of start lobbying their Western governments for help and assistance. And, I'm not so sure how likely that is after a 20-year war against the Taliban that Western governments are going to start arming and training anti-Taliban fighters, but they are certainly making this push. They are trying to sort of mobilize anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, well, I guess I'll disagree with you a little bit there. And to some extent, I think it may be unlikely that the Pentagon or that there would be maybe an overt program to train these guys. But the CIA, I think, can very much identify this. And this is something that I talked about with Scott Horton last week on the show. And we have a great segment like on the possible relationship with China. But I think one thing the CIA is really going, and even the Pentagon will try to do, is roll anything they want to do now into Afghanistan, into the great power competition argument, and say that, we have to have some, proxy force of our own in Afghanistan to check the Chinese influence. And I'm even seeing this, just from, random either think tank heads or just, conservatives mostly on Twitter who, just the Afghan people don't matter. So, we should make their country as unstable as possible. That way China can never connect itself to the Middle East through Afghanistan or mine their lithium or something like that. So I do think that, it's a real possibility that we could end up backing these people, even if it's through more covert CIA, Timber Sycamore-esque programs. But these are, some pretty brutal warlords involved here. We're talking about, in particular, Dostum, who is renowned for sodomizing people with a barrel of a rifle. That's what he is known for. I think he actually, for years, had to live outside of Afghanistan in exile because even by Afghan standards, he was a war criminal. And so these are definitely not the people you want to be backing. And while I would be horrified if the U.S. was backing the Taliban, because they're going to be, I'm guessing, not too great of rulers in their country as they consolidate power and everything. But at the same time, we know that Dostum's a horrible man, and the warlords here involved are very problematic, and we should just take no part in this anymore.
Yeah, yeah, and absolutely. Don't get me wrong. I don't doubt that the CIA or some intelligence faction might back some of these fighters. I was just saying I doubt that there's going to be this massive push to help them take back the country from the Taliban. Sort of what Massoud was asking for in that op-ed. I'm not so sure he's going to get all the help that he wants. Although, yes, certainly, I don't doubt that there will be some help to those groups.
Right.
However, there was one thing I wanted to mention that you had talked about on the show one of the last times we were on. You were saying how, we might sometime soon get some reporting that explains exactly how the Taliban took over the country. Like, why did all of these cities fall one by one with not much resistance from the Afghan military? And there's this guy, Atta Mohammed Noor. You mentioned him a little while ago. He is the former governor of Balkh province, and he's a warlord, a major warlord in the group called Jamaat-e-Islami. And he was tweeting some pretty interesting stuff just before the fall of Kabul that I think kind of goes in the direction of what you're talking about, of possibly explaining how all this happened. And so Kabul fell on a Sunday. And on that Saturday, if people are watching the video version, they can see the tweet on the screen. But Noor he tweeted that his home province of Balkh was captured because of a, quote, very deep conspiracy. And that he's saying that Kabul is now facing the same thing. And that he also said in a separate tweet, he said, despite all of our firm resistance, all the government and military equipment was handed over to the Taliban as a result of a big, organized, and cowardly plot. And then in another point, he said he has a lot of untold stories to share about how all this happened. And as far as I know, he hasn't said any more about this. And certainly I leave open the possibility he could just be kind of talking big to sort of explain this big defeat. He was chased out of Mazar Sharif, and he had to flee to Uzbekistan. So that was kind of, I'm sure, a humiliation for him. And so maybe he wants to have a story about a conspiracy to explain that. But I am certainly interested to hear more about what he's talking about here, about this supposedly big cowardly plot. I presume he means something about the Afghan military, that there was a plot to kind of just fold and hand over the cities without much resistance, which wouldn't seem that implausible given what happened. But sorry,
and I'll add to that a little bit, Will, because I believe the day before this tweet was put out and the city fell, there's a big offensive by the Taliban at that time. They probably captured between 9 and 12 provincial capitals by that time. And this was, they were kind of making it out that the Mazar-e-Sharif was going to be one of the places that the Afghan government was really going to put up a fight, to the point where the president of the country, Ghani, actually flew to the city that day. And I guess he was there with Dostum and Noor to, rally some troops a little bit. And so maybe, he feels like there was some double crossing, even going up as high as the president. He was baited to go out there and then the army fell or something like that. So really interesting point, Will. And anything else on that?
No, certainly. I checked his Twitter before we went on to see if he put out anything else since, but no, I think the 14th is the last time he said something. So I will, continue to check back on that.
All right, so I got just a couple news stories I wanted to bring up. The Pentagon is now reporting that they have 5,200 troops at Kabul airport. I think they've, kind of said they'll go up to 7,000, but it's exactly unclear of if all 7,000 will make it to Kabul, or if they're stationing them more in Kuwait or Qatar to do some processing. Now, Will, I've seen a variety of numbers on how many people have been evacuated from Afghanistan, and I think the Biden administration did something a little bit tricky today. So I just want to clarify to people. Prior to this weekend, the U.S. was reporting their own numbers for evacuation. They were reporting about 7,000 up until that time. However, NATO was reporting evacuating 18,000. Today, Biden gave a speech, and I think he said that the U.S. had evacuated about 26,000. And so rather than the U.S. evacuating 20,000 over the weekend, which seems well beyond their capacity, I believe he's now rolling the total NATO coalition numbers and kind of claiming it as the U.S. number. And so it is worth noting that, that there are more people than just the U.S. is taking out. But if you see this number jump up, I think that is the cause of that. that. As far as it goes in Afghanistan, goods are entering the country again through multiple border crossings. I find this to be important, Will, because one of the big threats from the Biden administration in the past weeks leading up to the takeover of the country by the Taliban was, if the Taliban take over country by force, they're going to be isolated and their neighbors aren't going to deal with them. But here again, we see that isn't the case, and all these countries are more than willing to have open borders, not open borders, but open their borders, to trade with Afghanistan to allow that to happen. Interesting. I read this from Idris Ali, who's Reuters Pentagon reporter, does a nice job on these issues. He says that the Pentagon says 3 Chinooks were used to pick up 169 Americans on Thursday from a hotel nearby Kabul airport. And I thought this was interesting, well, because it's the first time, as far as I could tell, since the Taliban took control over Kabul, that U.S. soldiers had actually left in any way Kabul airport. And I'm wondering if this showed that maybe there was some coordination going on between the U.S. and the Taliban to evacuate these people, because I'm guessing from the statements that the Taliban had put out and the fact that they didn't make a big deal about this, that they were okay with it and probably aware that it was happening at the very least.